country has in many ways been misdirected for the last half century. We've had too many politicians preaching the politics of fear and anger. And that narrative of fear and anger has made us tolerate abuse and unfairness, and we have to change the narrative. I'm going to warn you that if you try to make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you will tolerate abuse, you will tolerate inequality, you will tolerate injustice, and we need to change the narrative. We've got to be more hopeful. Change the narrative about race in this country. When I grew up, nobody in my community thought they could go to the University of Delaware. The University of Delaware was not a school that was perceived to being open to people of color. And today you have all of these graduates of color, and it is so important that that continue. But we will not be free in this country until we deal with our history of racial inequality. You see, I don't think we're actually confronting problems that we need to confront. We are a post-genocidal society. On this continent, there were Native people, indigenous people, Native Americans, and they were slaughtered by the millions by white settlers. And we haven't talked about that genocide. We haven't done the things you're supposed to do. We had decades, centuries of enslavement. Delaware was a slave state. This region was corrupted by that legacy. And the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude, it wasn't forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. We made up this ideology of white supremacy that we haven't confronted. And in the 13th Amendment, if you read it, it talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor, but it doesn't deal with this narrative of racial difference. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades where we had lynching and violence and terrorism, and people of color fled from the American South to communities all over this country. The people of color in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants seeking new economic opportunities. They came to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror, and we haven't talked about what that's done. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about lynchings and violence, and that history is something we haven't dealt with. We've got to change that narrative, even when we talk about segregation and civil rights. We're too celebratory when we talk about the civil rights movement. We did something terrible in this region by tolerating segregation. Segregation was awful. We told black people, you can't vote just because you're black. We said to people of color, you can't go to school with the rest of us because you're a person of color. My parents were humiliated. My father was humiliated every day of his life. Those signs that said white and colored weren't just directions, they were assaults. And we got to change that narrative. I believe that there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that we tolerate for too many people in our society, and to change that, we've got to change the narrative. We should have committed to a process of truth and reconciliation, but we didn't do it. It may seem a little outrageous, but I actually think it's critical. Today you become one of our leaders. As a college graduate of this university, you become someone in whom many people have invested time and money and resources. Your family has supported you to achieve something, and you have achieved something. But now you need to do something in response. You need to give something back. And whether you studied engineering or agriculture or business or the arts or sciences, you actually have the capacity to make a difference in the world. And we need you to make a difference in the world. Our world is very challenged right now. Our climate, our environment is being threatened. There's conflict and insecurity all around the world. There are challenges that we are facing in health sciences. There are people living in the margins of our society, and I believe we need a community of people who are committed to changing the world. In my field of the criminal justice system, we desperately need changes. The United States is a very different country today than it was 50 years ago. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans with criminal arrest, which means that when they try to get a job or try to get a loan, they are disfavored. The number of people in jails and prisons in this region has quadrupled. There is despair and hopelessness in many of our communities. In places like Wilmington and Trenton and sections of Philadelphia and DC, in urban communities all across this country, there are 12 and 13-year-old children who do not believe that they're going to be free by the time they're 21. We have these collateral consequences. In my state of Alabama, 30% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction, and we need to create more hope, more change. The Bureau of Justice now predicts that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. That wasn't true in the 20th century, it wasn't true in the 19th century, it's become true in the 21st century. And I could talk about problems with regard to climate change, I could talk about problems with regard to international issues, I could talk about problems in the health sciences, but I didn't really come to talk about problems, I want to talk about solutions. I've given you an assignment, but I hope to give you just a few words that might help you complete the assignment. There are 4 things I hope you'll do as a UD graduate, as a proud Bluey. And the first is, I hope you will get proximate to the places in the communities where you live, the places where you move. I want you to get proximate to the people in your communities that are suffering, that are living in poverty, that are struggling, that are in jails and prisons, that are living in the margins of society. I think in proximity to the problems that you find, you will find how you can change the world. There is power in proximity. Many of you have been taught your whole lives that if you live in a space where the schools aren't very good, if you live in a space where there's a lot of abuse or violence somewhere, if you live in places where there are mentally ill people or people dealing with drug addictions, you should stay as far away from those places as possible. I'm here to tell you this morning that I think you should do the opposite. As a college graduate, I hope you'll get proximate to the people and the places and the spaces in your community where there's suffering and abuse. And I hope you'll recognize that there is power in proximity. I grew up in a community in this state where black children could not go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. I'm so proud today that my father is here with me. But when he was a teenager in Georgetown, Delaware, there were no high schools for black children. He could not go to high school there. And then lawyers came into our community and they opened up the public schools, and their choice to get proximate to poor kids like me made it possible for me to go to high school. I graduated from Cape and Logan High School, and then I got to go to college. I went to college in Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you, when I was in college, I loved it. I was very active in music, I was very active in sports, I studied philosophy, and after my second year in college, I woke up one morning, and I thought to myself, I love college. And I made a decision. I decided I was going to stay in college for the rest of my life. And I called my mom, I said, Mom, I've made a decision, I'm going to stay in college the rest of my life. And my mom said, I didn't go to college, but I don't think they're going to let you do that. I said, no, Mom, they will. And because I was a philosophy major, I used to think I was supposed to go out on the hillside and think these deep thoughts. And so during my senior year, I'd go outside and I'd sit on the hillside and I'd think these deep thoughts. And one day someone came up to me and they said, you're a senior and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized for the first time nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And so I frantically tried to figure out how to stay in school, and because I'd never gone to college, nobody in my family had graduated from college, I didn't know what all of you know. I didn't know that in this country, if you want a graduate degree, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get a graduate degree, to get into graduate school, you actually have to know something about history, English, or political science. It was very intimidating to me, so I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found law school. It was really clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that, and a few months later found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, deeply disillusioned. Because I went to law school because I was concerned about racial inequality, I was concerned about poverty, I was concerned about inequality, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or poverty or inequality. And I was about to give up on this aspiration of being a lawyer until I got proximate. I went to Georgia and met condemned prisoners on death row. I met people literally dying for legal assistance, and proximity with this community changed me. All of a sudden, I knew I could make a difference. And it is in proximity that I believe you will find powers that you may not know you have. When you are proximate as a college graduate with people who don't believe they're going to be free by the time they're 21, when you are proximate to people who are suffering from abuse and despair, when you are proximate to people who have been marginalized for a long time, when you are proximate to people who are new members of our society, you can change the world, and your proximity will make a difference. The second thing I'm going to urge you to do as you change the world is I need you to change the narratives that create many of the problems that we are confronting. The problems that we talk about in this world are not just policy decisions. We made some bad policy decisions, don't get me wrong. 40 years ago, we decided to deal with drug addiction in America as a crime problem. We could have said that drug addiction and drug dependency is a health problem, but we said it was a crime problem. We didn't do that for alcoholism. We said that alcoholism, that's a health problem. That's a disease. And today, if we recognize someone who suffers from alcoholism and we see them going into a bar, we don't think, let me call the police. We understand that that requires a different intervention, but we didn't do that for people dealing with drug addiction and drug dependency. And now we have sent hundreds of thousands of people to jails or prisons. I represent people who've been convicted of simple possession of marijuana who've been sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. I represent people who've written bad checks for $20 and $30 who've been sentenced to life without parole. I represent children, 13 and 14 years of age, sentenced to die in prison. And the reason why these policy decisions were made was because there was a narrative underneath them. Our country has in many ways been misdirected for the last half century. We've had too many politicians preaching the politics of fear and anger. And that narrative of fear and anger has made us tolerate abuse and unfairness, and we have to change the narrative. I'm going to warn you that if you try to make decisions rooted in fear and anger, you will tolerate abuse, you will tolerate inequality, you will tolerate injustice, and we need to change the narrative. We've got to be more hopeful. I also think we have to change the narrative about race in this country. When I grew up, nobody in my community thought they could go to the University of Delaware. The University of Delaware was not a school that was perceived as being open to people of color. And today you have all of these graduates of color, and it is so important that that continue. But we will not be free in this country until we deal with our history of racial inequality. You see, I don't think we're actually confronting problems that we need to confront. We are a post-genocidal society. On this continent, there were Native people, indigenous people, Native Americans, and they were slaughtered by the millions by white settlers, and we haven't talked about that genocide. We haven't done the things we're supposed to do. We had decades, centuries of enslavement. Delaware was a slave state. This region was corrupted by that legacy, and the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude. It wasn't forced labor. I believe the great evil of American slavery was the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate it. We made up this ideology of white supremacy that we haven't confronted. And in the 13th Amendment, if you read it, it talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor, but it doesn't deal with this narrative of racial difference, and because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades where we had lynching and violence and terrorism, and people of color fled from the American South to communities all over this country. The people of color in Cleveland, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants seeking new economic opportunities. They came to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror, and we haven't talked about what that's done. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear someone on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terrorism. We had to worry about lynchings and violence, and that history is something we haven't dealt with. We've got to change that narrative, even when we talk about segregation and civil rights. We're too celebratory when we talk about the civil rights movement. We did something terrible in this region by tolerating segregation. Segregation was awful. We told black people, you can't vote just because you're black. We said to people of color, you can't go to school with the rest of us because you're a person of color. My parents were humiliated. My father was humiliated every day of his life. Those signs that said white and colored weren't just directions, they were assaults. And we got to change that narrative. I believe that there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that we tolerate for too many people in our society, and to change that, we've got to change the narrative. We should have committed to a process of truth and reconciliation, but we didn't do it. In South Africa, there's a recognition that they couldn't recover from apartheid without truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, they recognize they have to have truth and reconciliation. If you go to Germany today, you'll see a country where they put markers and stones at the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to Auschwitz and Birkenau and reflect soberly on that history. In this country, we do the opposite. We don't talk enough about the legacy of slavery and segregation and lynching, and we have to change that narrative. But we can't change the world by just changing narratives and getting proximate. The third thing I'm going to urge you to do is to stay hopeful. You've got to be hopeful. Sometimes when you come to college, you have these grand ambitions, and your professors complicate things. They make the world so much more complex than you thought it was going to be, and that's their job. You can't fault them for it. But sometimes it makes you begin to think that you cannot change the world the way you hoped. It makes you begin to think you can't do the things you need to do, and I'm going to urge you to reject that. You can change the world, but you've got to be hopeful. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. You've got to find ways to protect your hopefulness. You've got to believe things that you've never seen. You've got to imagine that you can do things you've never done. And in your hope, you'll realize the power that you have. I had the great privilege when I moved to Montgomery of meeting Rosa Parks. Johnny Carr was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott, and when I moved to Montgomery, Ms. Carr called me up, and she said, "Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer, just moved to our community." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Well, I'm Johnny Carr. I was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott." I said, "Well, it's such an honor to talk with you, Ms. Carr." She said, "Well, since you're a lawyer, I'm going to call you up sometimes, and I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak. And then sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen. And then she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, 'Yes, ma'am.'" So I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she would call me up and send me places to talk and send me places to listen. And one day she called me up and she said, "Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. Do you want to meet Miss Parks?" I said, "Yes, Miss Carr, I would love to meet her." She said, "Well, I'm going to invite you over to come to the porch where me and Miss Parks and Virginia Durr, a white woman whose husband Clifford Durr, are going to get together and talk. And do you want to come over and listen?" I said, "Oh, yes, Miss Carr, I do want to come over and listen." And every now and then she would say, "Now, Bryan, what does the word listen mean?" And I had to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything. And I went over and I sat on the porch with these older women and I listened to them talk for 2 hours. They were in their 80s, but they weren't talking about what they had done. They were talking about what they were going to do. And there was a hopefulness in their voices. They had hopes to change the world after all they had done. And I just soaked it all up. And after a couple of hours, Ms. Parks turned to me and she said, "Now, Bryan, tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do." And I looked at Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And then I gave her my rap. I said, "Well, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to do something about racial bias. We're trying to do something about the mentally ill, who are half the people in our jails and prisons. We're trying to do something about women being sent to jails and prisons. We're trying to do something about children. We're trying to do something about conditions of confinement." I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, "That's going to make you tired, tired, tired." And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger in my face and she said, "That's why you've got to be brave, brave, brave. I will tell you that if you try to change the world, you will get exhausted. But if you are courageous, you will find in that exhaustion a kind of power that we desperately need." Fourth and finally, you cannot change the world by just getting proximate, just changing narratives, just being hopeful. The fourth thing you have to do is that you have to be willing to do uncomfortable things. And I hate saying that. This is a joyous day. You don't need anybody telling you to do something uncomfortable. But I have to tell you because I really believe we need you to help us change things. And you cannot change the world by only doing what's convenient and comfortable. Sometimes you're going to have to do the uncomfortable things. You're going to have to position yourself in places that feel uncomfortable. You're going to have to situate yourself in spaces and do things that are uncomfortable. Sometimes you're going to have to be the person who stands up when everybody else is saying, "Sit down." You're going to have to be the person who speaks up when everybody else is saying, "Be quiet." But when you do those uncomfortable things, you change the world. There's a different metric system I'm going to urge you to think about. You've gotten all of the things you need to graduate from college. You've done well. But I want to tell you, don't ever think that your capacity to change the world is measured by the grades you've gotten. No matter what your grades, you have the capacity to change the world. Don't think that the income you acquire when you leave this place is a limit on your capacity to change the world. There's a different metric system if you want to change the world. It was taught to me by an older man. I was giving a talk in a church, and this older man came into the church. He was an older black man in a wheelchair. He was sitting in the back of the church staring at me the whole time I was talking with this very stern, almost angry look on his face. I couldn't figure out why is he looking at me so harshly. And I got through my talk and people came up, they were very nice and appropriate, but that older black man was sitting in the back and he kept staring at me. And finally, when everybody else left, he got a young person to wheel him to the front of the church in this wheelchair, and he had this stern, angry look on his face as he came down that aisle. And when he got in front of me, he put his hand up and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I mumbled something, I don't even remember what I said. But then he asked me one last time, he said, do you know what you're doing? And I stepped back, and then this older man looked at me, he said, I'm going to tell you what you're doing. And then this man looked at me and he said, you're beating the drum for justice, you keep beating the drum for justice. And I was so moved, so very moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what was going to happen. And then this older man grabbed me and he pulled me by my jacket into his wheelchair. He said, come here, I'm going to show you something. And this older man turned his head. He said, you see this scar I have behind my right ear? He said, I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head. He said, you see this cut I have down here at the bottom of my neck? He said, I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, trying to register people to vote. He turned his head, he said, you see this dark spot? He said, that's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama in 1965, trying to register people to vote. And then this man looked at me, he said, I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, people look at me, they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars. He said, but I'm going to tell you something. He said, these aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars. He said, these are my medals of honor. You are adorned today. By your achievement in business and the arts and sciences and engineering, you will be honored for all that you have put in your mind. And I want you to take what you have in your mind and do good things. But I also want you to protect what you have in your heart. You change the world when you allow the ideas in your mind to be fueled by some conviction in your heart. I believe really simple things. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing that they have ever done. I think if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer, and justice requires that we know the other things we are. I also believe that in this country, in this region, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think we talk too much about money in America. I believe that the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we change the world. And finally, I believe that when you leave this place, you cannot judge your character, your commitment to changing the world, what you have learned through this education, by looking at the way you interact with people who have power and privilege. We cannot judge how we're doing in this country by how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. We have to judge how we're doing in this country by looking at how we treat the poor, the incarcerated, and the marginalized. I am excited because I know that you have the capacity to change the world. And I just hope that all of the things you have in your mind will be synced with all of the things that you have in your heart. And you'll be someone who chooses to get proximate, someone who will change narratives, someone who stays hopeful, someone who does uncomfortable things. And for that, you will honor this community, you will honor your families, you'll honor all of those who've made sacrifices for you to be here today. I wish you the best in that pursuit and wish you all the best, Jeffrey. Thank you very much.